Hey folks, hope you're doing okay there in home quarantine. Hope you're stocked up on ramen noodles and Pepsi and all that good stuff. So Michaela has asked me to go over the stages of development. So I'll start with this entire slide and then cover the stages 2 through 5. Stage 1 is covered on the beginning of this slide. So firstly, it says, what is the DTM? That refers to what you see at the very top of the screen, the demographic transition model. And remember, demographic means the study of people. Transition means how it changes. And the models would be referring to, if you look at the 5 little pyramid pictures on the bottom of that little diagram on the top right of your screen, stages 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Those would be each of the little models. So it says, what is the DTM? A theoretical model, meaning it doesn't perfectly apply to like any one country in the world, but you can use it to make generalizations about countries by looking at a country's population pyramid and what is projected on that pyramid. So as an example, if you look at stage 1 on that picture on the screen right now, and then look at the population pyramid that is directly beneath that, the one that looks like, remember our, let me get that in the middle of the screen, like our praying grasshopper, okay? You can make generalizations on or about that by saying that if the bottom is super wide, that means this country has a ton of babies, meaning birth rates are really high. That's what we call the CBR, that point number 1 on the left, which was one of our vocab terms. And the CDR, the crude death rate, we can see is also equally really high if we look at this same population pyramid. And I can write on the screen. What I'm looking at right now is this right here. Okay, all of this information in that pyramid directly correlates to this information here and this information here. So to explain that, first of all, no country is in stage 1 of population growth anymore. For most of humanity, from literally the dawn of man, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years ago, up until about 1700, 1750 or so, every country was in that first stage that I just highlighted there. And what the pyramid is showing you, again, high birth rates at the bottom, high death rates at the top, because if the pyramid is skinny at the top, that means very few people, if any, are even living into those older age brackets. Because remember, as you go up the population pyramid, that is incrementally higher ages, like 0 to 4 at the bottom, and then like 80 plus at the very top. So if the top is skinny, ain't no old people because they all dead. So we see at the graph directly above this, if you follow those arrows that are coming off of the pyramid I circled, like at the very top here, you see that the birth rates are super high and death rates are really high. That is what we would describe as stationary, okay? Meaning for every birth, there's an equivocal death. So they kind of cancel each other out. So the high part meaning high birth rates, high death rates. The stationary part more so relates to the population growth. You notice it's stationary. You don't see it really changing at all. The population growth rate is very stagnant. We call that zero population growth, or ZPG, if you didn't already have enough acronyms to memorize. So furthermore, at the top left, it says based on the historical population trends of 2 demographic characteristics that I kind of just explained, crude birth rate and crude death rate. And to explain those 2 terms, the crude birth rate refers to the number of births in any given year out of 1,000 people. So if you just pulled 1,000 names off of the US Census and checked to see how many of them had babies within the last year, if 15 of them out of 1,000 had babies, then that's your crude birth rate, 15 over 1,000. And crude death rate would be the opposite. If you pulled 1,000 names off of the US Census from last year and checked to see statistically how many of them are deceased now, then let's say it's 4 out of 1,000, then your death rate is 4 over 1,000. Okay, you add those 2 together, essentially not factoring in and out migration. It tells you simply by births and deaths, is that country growing or is its population declining? But again, population pyramids do not take immigration into account at all. That's one of the kind of flaws of it to some degree. Let me erase this stuff. So if I start talking about other stuff, I don't confuse you. Okay, so it says a country will shift from one stage to another as it develops economically, meaning like as it starts to make more money and as they start to build things like factories, the lives of people change. Development meaning they shift from an agriculturally based society to an industrialized society where people aren't all living on farms. Like if you looked at the demographic makeup of America 400 years ago in 1620, well, first of all, there wouldn't have been that many Europeans here anyway, but the people that were here were literally living hand to mouth. They were farmers. There was no machines, no mechanization, nothing like that. But with that development, fast forward to 2020, you eventually have a gradual decrease in birth rates and in death rates. People choose to start having fewer babies for a number of reasons. It could be pursuing education, it could be pursuing a job, like a career. It could also be because as a country develops and there tend to be fewer farmers, you don't need 13 kids to be your farm hands anymore. Plus, kids statistically are going to live longer as a country develops because of better medical technology. So whereas a family 100 years ago might have, on average had 10, 12 kids, like that was the norm, they might have done that because they knew that statistically 5 of those kids were likely going to die because the country did not have the medical advances to keep a lot of people alive. So you had a high number of babies. I call it the sea turtle effect. Like a sea turtle has hundreds of babies because by the time those babies hatch and try to make it into the ocean, hundreds of them are getting picked off by seagulls and half of them don't even make it to the water. So that's kind of how, on a much smaller scale, American families used to be 100, 200 years ago. So your birth rates are always going to decline as a country gets more developed, and the death rates also start to decline, and you see that in the drop, as you see this dropping and this dropping. Death rates are going to drop because medical technology gets better, whereas the birth rates drop typically by choice. Okay, it says, what do the stages of the DTM reflect about a country? The demographic transition model defines population dynamics, meaning, you can look at this country, has a lot of young boys and a lot of young girls, and maybe not a lot of elderly, whereas this country in stage 4 has a lot more older people when you compare it to a country in stage 1, which again, no country is in stage 1 now, but you can kind of see the differences there. It says, furthermore, it provides insights into fertility, the roles of women and labor, etc. So, we can talk about fertility. You see those birth rates starting to drop as you get, especially from stage 2 here to stage 3. The bottom of the pyramid in this one, you don't have that pyramid extension that you did have in stage 2 if I were to like fill that in, because women are choosing to have lower fertility rates. Okay, they might be using contraceptives, or again, they could just be pursuing jobs and career stuff. And that also plays into the roles of women. As a country develops more, women are seen to be far more equal and they have more reproductive choices, and thus they choose to have fewer children. And the pyramids also tell you a little bit about labor. You can always suspect, let me do some more erasing here. You can always make the generalization that when a country's, the bottom of their pyramid is super wide, like in stages 1 or stages 2, which there are plenty of countries that are still in this stage right here, that most of the people are involved in jobs that deal with farming, fishing, mining, and forestry, because those primary types of jobs are jobs that require very little schooling or knowledge. You can be totally illiterate and still cut down trees. You can be fairly illiterate and still, learn how to farm and do some of the other types of jobs. Like, fishing doesn't really require literacy. It just requires the knowledge of, setting up the line, doing the hook, creating a net, all of which doesn't really require high educational knowledge. Okay, you don't need to go to college to learn how to fish. But typically as a country progresses, if you see the bottom of that pyramid shrunk in and it gets really like narrow, like this one, it's probably the most narrow bottom of the pyramid. That and stage 5, which I don't like this stage 5 picture in this illustration. But the more shrunk in that bottom is, the more people you're actually going to have involved in secondary and tertiary jobs, because we can see they've chosen to have fewer children, thus they are likely involved in some type of manufacturing job, or maybe they've joined a service industry, like they've become a cop or a bus driver or something like that. Okay, it also says that in stage 1, some of the characteristics of that are, let me use the highlighter now, I'll try this out. Okay, it says that pre-industrial society, again, super old school. While there are no countries that are living in this stage today, there are definitely societies that live in this stage today, like tribal societies that live in the Amazon. They definitely live in rural areas that don't get any more rural than the Amazon, and those people have zero concept of urbanization. There are tribes in the Amazon that have literally had no contact with modern man. Like, they don't even know what the airplanes are that they see flying over them. It's like completely beyond them. High fluctuating birth rates and death rates, and very low life expectancy. When a country is in stage 1, like, ain't no hospitals. You know, you get a cut on your foot, you could die in like a week from an infection. And those really fluctuating birth rates and death rates are a result of numerous things. Like, let's take climate, for example. If the harvest is really good one year because the climate is awesome and you just create a huge surplus of wheat, then birth rates might be high because you can support having those babies. But maybe the next year, climate sucks, there's no rain, there's a famine, a bunch of people die. Something as simple as tribe on tribe war can greatly fluctuate the birth rates and death rates from year to year. And disease. You know, like, I guarantee hundreds of years from now, even though none of these countries today are in stage 1, you'll be able to look at population pyramids from 2020 and see how the coronavirus affected the birth rates and death rates throughout the world, you know, especially in countries like Italy, for example. As a real example historically of a country that was in stage 1, we could use Italy in 1347 when the bubonic Black Death struck that country, and you saw a massive fluctuation of death rates within that country. Half the population died in that one year alone, and that is because there is little medical knowledge when a country is in stage 1. In 1347, like, they had no concept of like microbiology or anything like that. The Yersinia pestis bacteria that was carried on the fleas that were riding on the backs of rats that were eventually getting to people in Europe, nobody had any idea of that. They thought that the disease was coming from sin and that they were being punished by God. So they had no idea how to treat the disease. It says society is mainly engaged in subsistence agriculture. Pretty much everybody in Italy in 1347 at that time, they were farmers, people living on medieval manors, serf peasants who toiled in the fields daily, which is why they were getting bit by the fleas on the rats and died. And again, no country is currently in stage 1. All right, now as a country enters stage 2 here of the demographic transition, which they call early expanding, it says the country still has an agriculturally based economy. So this could have been maybe the US in, you know, the 1700s or so. Current countries that are still in this stage could include, honestly, way more than these 3, but Yemen, which is like south of Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan in the Middle East, and Nepal. That's that little itty bitty country north of India in the Himalayas. It says it starts to become commercialized, meaning they start to develop, or they kind of planting the seeds of industry. It says the crude birth rate is stationary or still very high. So like, if you look at this population pyramid down here at the bottom, if we're looking at the stage 2 part, oops, I didn't mean to highlight that part. Let's get rid of that. we can see that the birth rate's still really high at the bottom, to some degree almost equally as high as they were in stage one. So the bottom of the pyramid hasn't really changed. That's why it says up here still high. But the crude death rate is rapidly starting to fall. So you will notice in stage two, you see the death rate starting to drop, okay? Which it didn't do that in stage one. Births and deaths were really high. In stage two, it shows us that the births are still really high. That line stays kind of straight, which is why the bottom of the pyramid down here from stage one to stage two remains pretty wide at the base. But that death rate dropping, that means people aren't dying off in as high of numbers. So you'll notice the top of this pyramid is significantly wider when you compare it from stage one to stage two. The top of that pyramid kind of fattens up, okay? So the CDR starts falling rapidly. That could be because of new agricultural and medical innovations. Maybe they have come up with ways to produce more food, so you can now feed people to live longer, or better nutrition, better medical innovations, advances in medicine, the way that doctors treat things, the way that they understand things. So these things combined with food surpluses, just meaning creating extra amounts of food, and the improved living conditions just equate to people living longer, okay? Higher life expectancy. So instead of the average person living to say 35, 40 in stage one, in stage two, the average person might be living well into their 50s or 60s. And that third point, excuse me, it says a significant increase in rural to urban migration. That's pretty standard in stage 2, 3, 4. In any of the stages past stage one, most migrations that are happening are predominantly from rural to urban. You don't see a lot of like counter urbanization, like where people are actually moving back to the country. That typically doesn't happen, since most of the population still resides in rural areas. So in stage two, you still have a lot of farmers and stuff. It says the natural increase rate, which we sometimes just call the NIR. You might sometimes also see it called the RNI. Some textbooks and some AP documents call it the rate of natural increase. It's the same thing. You're essentially just adding the CBR and the CDR together. When you put them together, you're either going to realize that population is growing or it is decreasing. In stage two, it's always going to be increasing. Matter of fact, the biggest fact that you should know about stage two of development and population growth is that population growth is the very highest in this particular stage. And you can see that here. And what we've highlighted on the graph is natural increase. You notice the, let me go back to my drawing tool, the gap between births. Births are really high, but deaths are starting to drop. So what that means is we are birthing far more people than are dying. That means numbers are increasing, okay? Which is why you see this line, the population growth, start to skyrocket in this stage. And it gets real high, and it will actually start to level out towards the end of stage three, which we haven't quite gotten to yet. So I guess we have gotten here. Stage three, late expanding. They call it late expanding because you notice at the end of stage three, like towards the end of this second arrow that I just drew, population growth starts to level out and it starts to slow. So it's really strong again here in stage two, but kind of starts to curtail in stage three. So late expanding. Get back to my highlighter. It says in conjunction with industrialization, meaning like, when you're combining population growth and industrialization and the growing of cities, you start to have different social needs, like what people want changes. So they start to want smaller families, because when you start to live in a city like Manhattan, for example, that part of New York City, you don't have room for a 13 kid family when you're living on the Lower East Side or something in an apartment that's like 600 square feet. You can't fit that many people there. And opportunities also change. You don't have as many people working on farms as you start to get, especially towards the end of stage 2. More educational and employment opportunities for women. So this is when we start to see women in stage 3 choosing to have fewer kids because they are seen as more equal. The men aren't solely the breadwinners or the earners of the family now. And they also start to use contraceptives because medically the country has started to get more advanced, whether that's condoms or birth control or family planning. So those things start to decline the birth rates. And the crude death rate is still falling. So let me erase all this stuff so I'm not, again, confusing you. Hope I'm not boring you too much. I hope this is informative and helpful. Where was I? Yeah, so when you get to stage 3, where are we? Right here, you start to see this. You see that death rate drastically, or wait, no, that's the birth rate. Let me go over here. So we start to see that death rate drop. It's only going to drop to a certain point because a country's medical advances are only going to get but like so good. This one that I was referring to is that birth rate dropping. So you notice we're in stage 3, we're actually starting to close the gap between births and deaths, whereas in stage 2 that gap was much larger. Okay, and we had a whole bunch of people being added. Towards the end of stage 3, you're starting to see fewer and fewer people get added to the country. It says the natural increase is declining. Okay, not as high as it is in stage 2. Remember, stage 2 always has the highest population growth. So countries that are in stage 3 now: Saudi Arabia in the Middle East, India and South Asia, South Africa, one of the few countries that's actually considered developed in the continent, and the country of Mexico. All right, so moving on to stage 4. Oops, wanted to use the eraser again. Okay, so in stage 4 we call that low stationary. You have similar yet sort of opposite characteristics of stage 1, and that sounds kind of confusing, so I'm going to explain that. Remember, in stage 1 we had a crap ton of babies and a crap ton of people kicking the bucket, which essentially X'd each other out, meaning 0 population growth. I know it's a very ugly 0. When you get to stage 4, you notice we've started to close that gap. So we have a similar yet opposite effect here. And what I mean by that is the birth rates start to get really low, okay? But the deaths are now getting really low as well. So they're both kind of at the same level. So there are very few births and very few deaths. And again, they start to cancel each other out. And we have, again, what we call 0 population growth, or very little population growth. So those are some of the similarities between stage 1 and stage 4. Okay, little population growth because, again, lots of birth rates, lots of deaths in stage 1. It's the opposite, very few births and very few deaths in stage 4. Okay, it says the crude birth rate and crude death rate are low, so natural increase rate is low. That's what I just explained. The low crude birth rate reflects a higher level of education and achievement. So now the country's gotten so advanced that the standard, mother and father might only be producing 2 kids, literally just replacing themselves when they die. Thus population doesn't really grow. If every parent only has 2 kids, then when those parents die, son and daughter essentially take their spot, and you see, again, stagnant population growth, or again, stationary. Low meaning low births and low deaths, stationary meaning you kind of see that flat curve as far as population growth. And it says, again, educational achievement, especially among women. Okay, lower rates of disease, higher food production because of things like GMOs and the third agricultural revolution. Population is very stable. Examples: us. Okay, the U.S. is in stage 4 right now. Australia, Canada, all nations that you would consider industrialized Western nations. Stage 5, I X'd out the illustration for stage 5 right here at the very bottom because I just thought it was a crappy representation, which is why I kind of brought in this one from a previous page of the document. This is a much better depiction of stage 5 because the key here is that you should see a very narrowing bottom, and in effect it almost looks like an upside down pyramid. Okay, if you remember watching that video on Japan from earlier in the year when we saw the one kid in the schoolhouse. So it says at this point the death rate is greater than or equal to, oh, that should say greater than or equal to the CBR. That's a typo there. That's going to confuse people. I didn't even realize that until now. So, you know, essentially, you're not having a lot of kids, and your old people, you know, they're living fairly long, and you're not even producing enough children to like replace the old people. Okay, and that becomes a huge problem. You can actually have a zero population growth, or what they call a natural decrease in the population, which is what Japan's experiencing now. Demographers have literally said if the Japanese don't start having kids, statistically they will become extinct as a people within the next several hundred years. Okay, I don't think that's going to happen, but I think that's not going to happen because they are going to choose to start having more babies in order to stay alive as a country. So examples include Germany. Does have a growing population because of net in-migration, again, which the population pyramids don't account for. Germany's taken in like a ton of asylum seekers from like Syria and Afghanistan and stuff, but Germans, like Japanese, are not having a whole lot of kids. Stage 5, you also do see, you know, again, like, let me see, right here you see those death rates kind of rising. This kind of ties in some degrees, and you'll see this on the subsequent pages of this study guide, because it talks about the epidemiologic transition, and in stage 5 you see the reemergence of pandemics that were thought to be eradicated in earlier stages. Kind of like, you know, I hate to say it, but we're living it right now. The reason you are seeing death rates increase in some countries, like right here, is because of things that we thought we had conquered, and you have these viruses that kind of change up the game and come back and start killing off, you know, massive amounts of people. So that was crazy long. That was like almost 30 minutes of explaining the stages of development, but I hope that was helpful to at least one of you, if not many of you. Peace. Wash your hands, don't touch your face.